I want to thank you for joining me for another Todd Talk, where we take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. So, oftentimes, when we're trying to challenge students in the classroom, when we're asking them to differentiate up, we want them to dig deeper. And we may say to them, you should dig a little bit deeper into that. But the question becomes, do we show them how to dig deeper? Do we give them processes that they can use in order to do so? Do we ask probing questions that get them to dig deeper? Students, just like anything, students need to be taught how to dig deeper. And so we need to make sure in our classrooms that we provide opportunities for them to do so and give them some guidance for what this might look like. So one thing to think about as a teacher is what you see here, which is Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy is a thinking pyramid. And you start at the bottom here with remembering, and then you work your way up to understanding and so on and so forth until you get to the higher levels of thinking, such as evaluating and creating. Now you can see this step set up like a step system. And if you want kids to be able to dig deeper, then you need to keep taking them up the stairs. So on the bottom level, they're just at the surface level. But if you want them to go deeper, they're going to have to keep taking steps. And you need to be able to set this up for them so they can see what this looks like. So here's a very basic way you can do that. So if we look at the standard of describe how a particular story or drama's plot unfolds in a series of episodes, and you were asking students to just think at a surface level, you might ask them to describe how the main character responds or changes as the plot moves towards its conclusion or resolution. You might ask people to explain why they think this character responded or changed the way that they did. These are all surface level because these are things probably that are blatantly stated in the book. And so we want to push a little bit deeper. So we might ask them to choose a secondary character and then suppose what they think about the main character. So looking at point of view. We may ask them to compare and contrast. How would they have handled this situation, the person themselves, as opposed to the main character? If we want to take it even further, we'll change a situation in the story. So change some part of the plot. How would characters have reacted if this change had occurred? Similarly, they could debate whether the main character's responses were justified. So they're going to evaluate whether what they did was correct and what criteria are they using. So we're starting to get much deeper rather than just the basic surface level of what we're getting from this novel. We're actually digging a little bit deeper and thinking about it in ways that we wouldn't normally think about. So another way that you can look at this is if you look at this standard right here, which is a math standard that is working with time and money. And it says tell and write time from analog and digital clocks to the nearest 5 minutes using AM and PM. So if we were asking students to do this, we would have questions like you see here, which is write the time on the clock is showing. If it's dark outside, what is this digital clock? Would this digital clock be an AM and PM? And then they could actually draw the hands on a clock when you give them a time and they have to draw the hands. This would certainly determine mastery of this content standard. But if we want to dig a little bit deeper, we could use Bloom's to do so. So if we wanted students to analyze, we might ask something like this. We give them these 4 different digital clocks, and we ask them to categorize what event would happen at what time. So students are having to take 2 pieces of information, the clocks, and they're having to take the situation, and they're having to match them up. So they're having to break down, okay, what most likely would be the bedtime time? What most likely is when we would have dinner, and so on and so forth. So they would have to rationalize this and be able to analyze this information to come up with their answers. If you wanted them to be able to evaluate, you might give them these 4 clocks that you see down here at the bottom. And you may say to them, all right, you need to make an argument for your bedtime to your parents. What argument do you make? How do you justify your rationale? How do you convince your parents or persuade them that this should be your bedtime? And so this becomes very real world because students may negotiate this all the time. And so we're making it relevant for them. And they get to choose whichever, there's no right or wrong answer. They get to choose which one they want, and then they have to make a good case for that. If we want to take it even further, we can have them create. And creating is taking all of this stuff and kind of putting it together. So in this case, you could ask students to invent a game in which those participating must use those surface level skills that they learned. But in order to be able to create the game, students have to have a really deep understanding of it in order to be able to do that. And so they might come up with a game like you see here that works a little bit like war. You have 3 piles of cards, and in one pile, the two piles, the blue and the red, you have analog and digital clocks showing a time. And then you have this neutral pile that you turn over, and it just gives you the hands of a clock. And you have to determine which of the 2 cards is closest to this time. And if you're closer, the other person has to take your cards, and this is how you play this game. And so by students having to create this game, they have to have a true understanding of what it is that they're learning, more at a basic level. They have to really, truly understand what that looks like. So the question becomes, when can you use these opportunities or these asking students to dig deeper? When can that be done? So there's various things you could do. So for example, you could do it in the activities that you do. So you see here this activity, which is a Renaissance Hall of Fame. And what you're asking students to do is you're asking them to look at some of the contributions that came from the Renaissance and to rank them, like which do you think are the most important? And more importantly, why do you think that is? So we're already asking at a higher level because we're asking the why. We're asking them to evaluate. We're asking them to justify. So that's already being done. So how can we push it even further? And so we can have something like you see this bonus opportunity here, which is actually designed. So creating this Hall of Fame, these inductees into the Hall of Fame is one thing, but could you actually make the Hall of Fame itself or design the Hall of Fame itself using what you know about Renaissance architecture? So students are taking what they know and they're applying it to the situation that they're doing, and they're showing what they've learned a little bit deeper than maybe just at that surface level. So this bonus opportunity gives them a chance to dig a little bit deeper with what it is that they're doing. This could also be in the projects that you do. So here's a couple of projects. So this one uses the depth and complexity icon. So we're looking at a language of the discipline. And so and for this project, students would have to pick a career that they're interested in and define 10 terms that would be really important to that profession. So they're learning language of the discipline. But if I want them to dig a little bit deeper, then what I might ask them to do is to do a more quantity. So rather than just do 10 of these, they could do 20 of these. And so now they're having to think even further. Here's the 10 most obvious ones, but what are some other ones that may be important to know? And so you could increase the volume is one way you can dig deeper. Another way that you can do it is you can kind of expand what the horizon of what they're looking at. So this is another project involving depth of complexity, specifically the one of trends. And students are looking at trends and what causes trends to go up, what causes them to go down. And students are going to create a trend timeline. And this trend timeline will show the pathway of a product or idea or whatever as it goes up and down and what causes these to do that. So again, already at a pretty high level. And so you're asking them to show this over like a 5-year period. You could expand this though to say, okay, look at this at a 10-year period. How about 50 years? How about 100 years? So students are having to think even more like, okay, I have to predict what might happen. I might have to not just look at what happened, but what might happen. So students are now having to dig a little bit deeper and to take what they know and what they learned and try to make a rational and logical decision on how this might be different somewhere down the road. So this is asking them to dig deeper. Another place you can do this is even in their homework. So when I had students do readings, I would often give them these bookmarks. And the idea of this is that I wanted them to think about what they had read a little deeper than maybe just comprehending. So you can see in here the one on when it comes to theme. And so the first question on the bookmark says, have you experienced the theme of the book in your own life? So students would have to reflect upon that and dig a little bit deeper and go into their own memories in order to do that. How do the actions and thoughts of the characters help you to determine the theme of the book? Also, what was the theme of the story? Was the theme of the story directly stated or was it implied? And so these questions, these probing questions, are what they're forcing students to do is they've read this material, they've comprehended it. Now we want you to think about it. Now we want you to dig a little bit deeper with this particular topic. And so you can do this with their homework without even being there asking. You could have the, like I said, I handed these bookmarks out to students depending on what I wanted them to be looking at. So you can see there's one here for character, there's one here for plot, and I could create them to fit whatever I wanted students to think about. The third thing that you might want to consider is assessment. So how are we going to dig deeper in an assessment? So you could do this in a couple of ways. One way I did this was that I gave kids choice on the question that they were going to answer on an assessment. So let's take this one that I did on the amendments, the Bill of Rights specifically. And so I asked students to look over these questions and then choose one, because any one of them shows mastery of the basics that the content standard asked them to. But I want to push them a little bit further, or I want to encourage them to push themselves. So a kid may look at the first one and say, that one's really easy. So might I ask myself another question? Might I take it a little bit further? So the first question asks to name the amendments in the Bill of Rights and what's each of them done. So it's a simple recall, a simple understanding. But the second question asks to explain how 3 of the amendments from the Bill of Rights help to bring about freedom to Americans. So this is an application. So how does freedom of speech, how does the right to bear arms, whatever one they choose, how does it apply to people's lives and their freedom? And then the last question is an evaluative question, which is pick one of the amendments from the Bill of Rights that you feel is most important to the country, and then justify your choice. Why is this so important? What does this do? I mean, what does it allow us to do? What would happen if it wasn't there? What would happen if we took it away? How would things be very different? And so when students look at this assessment, they don't have to answer all 3. They're answering one of them. But students may look at the first one and say, that's not much of a challenge. And so they go to the second one, or they may go to the third one, which is the most complex of them. And so they're going to dig deeper themselves. So I've given them the pathway, and then they can choose that pathway whether they want to or not, but they don't have to. Another thing to consider is reflection. So how can we have reflection? Is after the fact, after the learning has been done, we want students to think about the learning. And so we can do this very content-based. So you see right here that students have been learning about parts of speech, and you ask them to reflect very specifically about parts of speech. What was the most important thing they thought they learned? How do they see themselves using these skills? And do they think it was worthwhile to learn about the parts of speech? So they're actually looking at the content itself. But they can also dig deeper into the process of what it is that they learn. So, for example, what you see here is, it could be applied to most anything, which is that did the lesson go as you hoped it would? Once we got into the lesson, what did you realize you needed to add to make it better? What do you believe went well with the lesson? And so on and so forth. What would they change about the lesson? So it's getting kids to think like, here is my basic lesson, but I'm going to really dig deep and analyze this lesson for what it was. And how could it have been been improved, or how would it have been made better? How would it have been different? And you can see the one at the bottom is, what do you think is my biggest failure or regret in this lesson? And now students are having to go internal. They're having to think, not just the knowledge they got, but the way that they worked on it. Okay, what did they feel was one of their biggest failures, and why? And so we want to have these reflection questions after the fact to, again, get them thinking about the learning, because the more thinking they do about the learning, the stickier the learning is, because now they can associate it with thinking, not just with facts, but they're thinking about it, which makes it so much more robust. So when you're looking at digging deeper, I've given you lots of suggestions of ways that you can purposefully do this in the classroom. You need to think, and I'm going to challenge you to dig a little bit deeper from this particular video. And so I want you to think, I want you to reflect upon this. What will you do in the classroom in order to intentionally get students to think deeper or to dig deeper? How will you set up your classroom? How will you set up your activities? How will you set up your assessments in order to encourage students to do this? And sometimes this may be requirements. Sometimes it may just be opportunities, like you saw the bonus opportunity. But either way, you are asking students to think about things a little bit deeper, with a little more intent, and to have more than just a basic understanding, but to truly, truly know what it is that they've learned and how they can use this.